Mother Bear left chained in heavy rain without shelter. What this baby did shocked everyone. Let us know where you're watching from. If you love my content, consider supporting it with a super thanks. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe. It'll help us to remain in touch with amazing people like you. The skies had darkened over the village of Pinewood Glen, carrying the promise of a storm that would test even the sturdiest of shelters. Rain fell in sheets, pelting against windows and turning the dirt paths into treacherous mud. Lightning flashed across the horizon, illuminating a dilapidated barn that stood isolated at the edge of the village. There, beneath the assault of raindrops and wind, a mother bear shivered, her dark fur matted against her skin, her large body trembling with cold. The villagers had chained her there 3 days ago when she had wandered too close to their homes. Fear had guided their actions, fear of what they did not understand, fear of the wild that encroached upon their supposed safety. The heavy iron chain clinked against the wooden post as the bear shifted, trying in vain to find some respite from the downpour. No shelter had been provided. Compassion had been forgotten in the wake of their terror. In a small cottage just beyond the meadow, nestled beneath the protective embrace of ancient oaks, lived the Reed family. Iris Reed busied herself with dinner preparations, her hands moving mechanically as exhaustion weighed upon her shoulders. Her husband, Thatcher Reed, had been away for 2 days, hunting in the nearby mountains, leaving her alone with their 15-month-old daughter, Ellie. Ellie Reed was an unusually quiet baby, with wide, observant eyes that seemed to hold wisdom beyond her years. While other babies her age babbled incessantly, Ellie spoke rarely, but when she did, her words carried purpose. She had just learned to toddle, her steps uncertain but determined, much like everything else she attempted. "Stay where I can see you, Ellie," Iris called absent-mindedly, stirring the vegetable stew that bubbled over the fire. The baby paid no attention, her gaze fixed on the window where raindrops raced down the glass. Outside, the storm intensified. The wind howled through the trees, bending branches until they nearly kissed the sodden earth. Through the rain-streaked window, something caught Ellie's attention, a dark shape moving by the old barn. Her small palms pressed against the cool glass as she peered out, curiosity piqued by the strange sight. The bear's painful growls were swallowed by the storm, but somehow Ellie sensed the creature's distress. She watched as the animal pulled against her restraints, desperate for freedom or at least shelter from the relentless rain. Hidden in the bushes nearby, barely visible through the downpour, a smaller form, a bear cub, cowered, afraid to approach its mother but unwilling to leave her side. "Mama," Ellie whispered, turning to look at her mother, who remained oblivious to both her daughter's concern and the suffering creature beyond their window. "Bear hurt." Iris didn't hear the soft words, the clatter of wooden spoons and boiling water masking her daughter's voice. Ellie turned back to the window, her little brow furrowed in concentration. Something about the bear's plight stirred emotion within her tiny chest, a compassion that adults in the village had long since abandoned. The baby's gaze fell upon her favorite blanket, a small patchwork creation that her grandmother had stitched together before passing away last winter. It was Ellie's most treasured possession, the item she sought whenever thunder boomed or nightmares disturbed her sleep. With determined fingers, she grasped the blanket from her small wooden chair. Lightning flashed again, illuminating the path between the cottage and the barn. A treacherous journey for anyone, let alone a child who had barely mastered walking. Yet, as Iris turned away to fetch herbs from the cabinet, Ellie seized her opportunity. The wooden door was heavy, but not latched, and with a push that required all her strength, the baby created just enough space to slip through. The rain immediately soaked through her thin cotton dress, plastering it against her skin. Cold droplets splashed against her face, causing her to gasp, but she did not cry out. Instead, clutching her blanket tightly, Ellie lowered herself to the ground, finding crawling more efficient than walking in the slippery mud. Inside the cottage, Iris continued her preparations, unaware that her daughter had ventured into the storm. Outside, the bear's labored breathing grew more pronounced as her strength waned. Her cub whimpered, a sound that spurred Ellie forward, blanket dragging in the mud behind her, determination guiding her every movement. The village remained quiet. Windows shuttered against the storm, no one witnessing the extraordinary scene unfolding. A tiny human child crawling through the rain toward a creature that most adults would flee from in terror. No one saw the way the mother bear's eyes widened as she caught the child's scent, or how her cub peeked out from the bushes, curiosity momentarily overcoming fear. No one, that is, except for Solomon Wright, an old hermit who lived on the village outskirts and who happened to glance out his window at that precise moment. His weathered hand flew to his mouth as he watched the small figure moving toward certain danger. "Good heavens," he whispered, reaching for his coat. "What is that child doing?" By the time Solomon had donned his boots and coat, Ellie had already reached the edge of the barn, her blanket now a sodden weight behind her, her dress caked with mud. The mother bear sensed her approach, muscles tensing beneath wet fur, a low growl rumbling in her throat. The chain clinked loudly as she shifted, preparing to defend herself against this new, unexpected threat. But Ellie paused, sitting back on her heels in the mud, seemingly unafraid as she gazed up at the massive creature. Their eyes met, deep brown animal eyes filled with suffering, and bright human eyes filled with innocence. For a moment, time seemed suspended between them, the rain's rhythm the only sound as predator and child regarded one another across an ancient divide. Then, slowly, Ellie held out her mud-soaked blanket, an offering of comfort from the smallest of hands. The bear's growl subsided as she studied the strange, tiny creature before her. Rain continued to pour down upon them both, but in that moment neither seemed to notice. The bear's nostrils flared, taking in Ellie's scent, milk and honey and something uniquely human. The great animal's eyes, intelligent and wary, held no malice, only exhaustion and a mother's worry. Ellie inched closer, the mud squelching beneath her palms and knees. Her tiny fingers extended the blanket toward the bear, who watched with a mixture of suspicion and curiosity. The cub in the bushes whimpered again, drawing Ellie's attention. Her head turned toward the sound, spotting the small trembling form partially hidden by rain-battered leaves. "Baby," Ellie whispered, understanding blooming across her features. Solomon Wright had reached the edge of his property now, his aged body protesting against the exertion and the cold rain seeping through his coat. His eyes widened in horror as he saw the Reed girl mere feet away from the chained bear. His throat closed with fear, knowing that shouting might startle the animal into violence. "Dear God," he muttered, willing his old legs to move faster through the mud. Back in the cottage, Iris Reed finally noticed the silence. No soft footfalls, no quiet babbling, the absence of sound that only a mother could detect. She turned from the stove, wiping her hands on her apron. "Ellie?" she called, her eyes scanning the room. "Ellie, where are you hiding, little one?" When no response came, panic fluttered in her chest. Her gaze fell upon the door, slightly ajar, rain spattering through the opening onto the wooden floor. Cold dread washed over her as she rushed to the door, flinging it wide. "Ellie!" she screamed into the storm, her voice carrying on the wind. At the barn, the bear suddenly shifted. the chain groaning against the wooden post as she moved. Ellie didn't flinch, her trust absolute in a way only the very young can maintain. Instead, she laid her precious blanket on the ground beside the bear, patting it as if inviting the massive creature to use it. The bear lowered her head, sniffing the offering. Her massive jaw could have ended the child's life in an instant, but something in the animal seemed to recognize the pure intent behind the gesture. The cub, emboldened by the peaceful exchange, crept forward from its hiding place, curiosity outweighing caution. Ellie's face brightened at the sight of the approaching cub. "Baby bear," she cooed softly, her tiny hand outstretched. Solomon had almost reached them now, his heart pounding with terror at what he might witness. But what he saw made him pause in astonishment. The mother bear, despite her obvious discomfort and the threatening presence of a human, was allowing her cub to approach the child. More incredibly, she hadn't made any aggressive move toward Ellie. The cub, wet and shivering, sniffed cautiously at Ellie's fingers. The baby giggled, the sound like silver bells cutting through the storm's fury. It was a moment of impossible connection. Wild and domestic, animal and human, innocence meeting innocence. Then, in a move that would later be described as miraculous by those who heard the tale, Ellie reached out and gently touched the cub's head. The small bear didn't retreat. Instead, it leaned slightly into her touch, desperate for warmth and comfort. The mother bear watched, muscles tense but making no move to interfere. Her dark eyes seemed to hold an ancient wisdom, a recognition that this small human meant no harm to her offspring. Solomon stood transfixed, reluctant to disturb the remarkable scene unfolding before him, but the moment was shattered by a distant cry carried on the wind. "Ellie! Ellie, where are you?" Iris's frantic voice spurred Solomon into action. He started forward again, knowing he must get to the child before the mother's cries alarmed the bear, but his movement caught the bear's attention. Her head snapped up, eyes locking onto this new threat, an adult human approaching her cub, and the strange little human who had shown no fear. A warning growl rumbled from deep within her chest, the sound reverberating through the rain-soaked air. The chain clinked ominously as she shifted her weight, positioning herself between the approaching man and the children, human and bear alike. Solomon froze, knowing that any sudden movement could provoke an attack. The bear's protective instinct had been triggered, and even chained, she was a formidable threat. The irony wasn't lost on him. The bear was now protecting Ellie alongside her own cub. "Easy there," he murmured, his voice barely audible above the rain. "I mean no harm to any of you." The bear's growl deepened, unconvinced. Behind her, Ellie seemed oblivious to the danger, her attention focused entirely on the cub who had now crept fully from the bushes to investigate the strange human cub. In the distance, Iris's calls grew more desperate. Other voices had joined hers. Neighbors roused by her panic, emerging from their homes despite the deluge to help search for the missing child. "Over here!" Solomon tried to shout, but his aged voice couldn't carry far enough through the storm. The bear's agitation increased with each passing second. The cub, sensing its mother's distress, retreated slightly, pressing against Ellie's side. The baby, responding to the animal's fear, did something extraordinary. She wrapped her small arm around the cub, as if to offer protection. Meanwhile, in another part of the village, an unexpected figure had arrived, drenched and exhausted from traveling through the storm. Thatcher Reed had cut his hunting trip short when the storm had grown too dangerous to continue. He'd returned to find his home empty and the village in an uproar, with his wife's cries echoing through the rain. "What's happened? Where's Ellie?" he demanded, gripping a neighbor's arm. "Missing," the man replied grimly. "Iris found the door open. The little one must have wandered out into the storm." Thatcher's face drained of color. Without another word, he dropped his hunting gear and joined the search. His knowledge of tracking now desperately needed despite the rain washing away all signs of his daughter's passage. At the barn, the situation had reached a precarious balance. Solomon stood motionless, unwilling to provoke the bear further. Ellie and the cub remained huddled together beside the mother bear, who maintained her protective stance despite her obvious discomfort from the chain cutting into her wet fur. Then a flash of lightning illuminated the scene, followed immediately by a deafening crack of thunder that shook the very ground beneath them. The sudden noise startled everyone. Solomon, Ellie, and most dangerously, the mother bear. With a roar of fear and rage, she lunged forward, the chain straining against the wooden post. The aged wood, weakened by rain and rot, groaned under the pressure. Small cracks appeared along its surface, splinters breaking free. Solomon watched in horror as the post began to give way. If it broke completely, the bear would be free, a terrified, protective mother with nothing between her and the humans who had chained her in the rain. "God help us," Solomon whispered, as the first villagers appeared in the distance, Iris and Thatcher Reed at the front of the group, their faces masks of parental terror as they spotted their tiny daughter beside the panicking bear. Thatcher's hand went instinctively to his hunting knife. "Ellie!" he shouted, breaking into a run despite the treacherous footing. The bear roared again, the sound echoing across the meadow, stopping Thatcher in his tracks. The wooden post cracked further, the chain shifting as the bear's massive strength was brought to bear against her restraint. And through it all, Ellie remained calm, her hand still resting on the cub's wet fur, her eyes wide but unafraid as chaos erupted around her. It was as if she understood something that the adults rushing toward her did not. That fear bred fear, that panic ensured disaster. "Wait," Solomon called out to the approaching villagers, his hand raised in warning. "Don't come any closer, the post is breaking." The villagers halted, their faces locked in expressions of horror and helplessness. Iris sobbed, her husband's arm around her shoulders, the only thing keeping her from rushing to her child. Thatcher's face was ashen, his body tense with the need to act and the knowledge that any action might endanger his daughter further. In that moment, as humans and bears faced each other across a divide of fear and misunderstanding, the rain seemed to intensify, as if nature itself was passing judgment on the scene. The wind howled through the trees, branches creaking under its force. Water pooled around the base of the post, further weakening its hold in the sodden earth. And then, something unexpected happened, something that would be whispered about in Pinewood Glen for generations to come. Ellie Reed, not yet 16 months old, looked up at the frightened faces of her parents and the villagers, then back at the terrified bear who stood over her. With the wisdom of innocence, she did the one thing no adult would have considered. She began to sing. It wasn't really singing as an adult would recognize it, more a melodic humming, a tune her mother often used to soothe her to sleep. But in the chaos of the storm, the simple sound carried a strange power. The bear's aggressive stance faltered, her roar dying in her throat as she tilted her head toward the unexpected sound. The cub, responding to the gentle noise, pressed closer to Ellie, seemingly comforted by the melody. Even the villagers fell silent, transfixed by the surreal tableau before them. A baby singing to a bear in the midst of a raging storm. For a heartbeat, everything was still except for the falling rain and Ellie's soft humming. Then, with a groan that seemed to come from the earth itself, the wooden post gave way completely. The bear was free. Gasps and cries of terror erupted from the watching villagers. Thatcher lunged forward, only to be held back by two neighbors who feared his movement would trigger an attack. Iris screamed her daughter's name, the sound tearing through the rain like physical pain. But the bear, despite her newfound freedom, didn't charge. She didn't flee. Instead, she stood motionless, the heavy chain still attached to her collar but no longer anchored to the earth. Her eyes, intelligent and assessing, moved from the child who still hummed softly to the cub pressed against her, to the adults whose fear she could smell even through the rain. Solomon Wright, who had lived alone with nature longer than anyone in the village, recognized the moment for what it was: a choice. The bear could attack, flee, or somehow find another path. Everything hung in the balance, with a baby's life as the stakes. Then, from the edge of the forest that bordered the meadow, a new sound emerged. A low, rumbling growl that was not the mother bear's. All heads turned toward the sound. There, partially obscured by rain and shadow, stood an enormous male bear, his fur darker than the storm clouds above, his size dwarfing the female bear's already substantial frame. The father bear had returned for his family. Time seemed to stand still as the massive male bear emerged fully from the forest's edge, rain cascading down his powerful form. His eyes, amber in the dim light, surveyed the scene with primal intelligence. The female bear now freed from her restraint, their cub huddled against a human child, the cluster of terrified villagers standing helplessly in the downpour. A growl rumbled from deep within his chest, the sound carrying a clear warning that sent shivers down the spines of everyone present. "Nobody move," Solomon whispered, though there was hardly any need for the warning. Terror had rooted the villagers to the spot, their faces pale as they beheld not one but two adult bears, with only open ground between the predators and themselves. The male bear took a step forward, his massive paws sinking into the mud. The female responded with a soft chuffing sound, communication that no human present could decipher. Whatever message passed between them caused the male to pause, his fierce gaze settling on Ellie and the cub with what appeared to be confusion. Thatcher Reed's hand tightened on his knife handle, his knuckles white with tension. Every instinct screamed at him to rush forward, to snatch his daughter from between the bears, but wisdom kept him still. One wrong move now would mean death, not just for himself, but potentially for Ellie as well. "My baby," Iris whimpered, her voice barely audible as tears mingled with raindrops on her cheeks. "Please, God, protect my baby." As if in answer to her prayer, Ellie chose that moment to look up from the cub. Her gaze landed on the newcomer, the father bear, and rather than showing fear, her face lit with a smile of recognition, as though she were greeting an old friend rather than facing a potential killer. "Bear," she said clearly, the word carrying across the distance between them. She pointed at the male, then at the female and cub. "Family." The simplicity of the statement, the innocent recognition of what bound these animals together, hung in the air like a revelation. The male bear tilted his head slightly, as though trying to comprehend this strange, fearless creature who identified what most adult humans had failed to see, that the bears were not mindless beasts but a family, with bonds as real and sacred as any human connection. The female bear moved then, her chain dragging behind her as she approached Ellie and the cub. The villagers gasped collectively, certain they were about to witness a tragedy. Thatcher broke free from the restraining hands of his neighbors, lunging forward with a cry of desperation. "Ellie, no!" His sudden movement startled the female bear, who swung her head toward the perceived threat, teeth bared in warning. The male bear responded instantly to his mate's alarm, rising onto his hind legs with a roar that seemed to shake the very air around them, raindrops scattering from his fur like tiny missiles. In that moment of escalating chaos, Ellie did the unthinkable. She stood up on her unsteady legs, placing herself between her approaching father and the bears, her tiny arms spread wide, as if she could somehow shield the animals from the humans, or perhaps the humans from the animals. The absurdity of it. A toddler attempting to prevent bloodshed between man and beast might have been comical in any other circumstance. "No," she said firmly, in the tone she used when refusing vegetables at dinner. "No hurt." Thatcher skidded to a halt in the mud, astonished by his daughter's intervention. The bear family seemed equally taken aback, the female lowering her aggressive stance slightly, the male dropping back to all fours, though his muscles remained tensed for action. The cub, sensing an opportunity in the moment of confusion, darted from behind Ellie to its mother's side, pressing against her wet fur for reassurance. The female nuzzled her offspring briefly, but her eyes never left the humans, particularly Thatcher, who stood frozen just yards away from his daughter. A tense silence descended, broken only by the constant patter of rain and occasional rumbles of distant thunder. Two fathers faced each other across the muddy ground, one human, one bear, each willing to fight to the death to protect their young, yet both held in check by the inexplicable actions of a child who seemed to recognize no distinction between the species. From the edge of the gathering, a new voice broke the impasse. Clara Bennett, the village healer and midwife who had helped bring Ellie into the world, pushed her way forward. Unlike the others, her face showed more curiosity than fear as she observed the standoff. "The child has the old magic in her," Clara murmured, just loud enough for those closest to hear. "My grandmother spoke of such things. Children born with the ability to speak to animals, to bridge the gap between our world and theirs." Several villagers crossed themselves at her words, superstition still strong in Pinewood Glen, despite the modern era that had begun to encroach upon their isolated community. Others scoffed, though quietly, unwilling to dismiss anything that might explain the extraordinary scene before them. "Nonsense," muttered Edgar Wilson, the village blacksmith. "The bears simply don't see her as a threat because of her size. It's nothing mystical." "Then explain why they haven't attacked," Clara challenged, her eyes never leaving Ellie. Two adult bears, one recently chained by humans, their cub in danger. By all natural law, we should be witnessing a massacre, not whatever this is. No one had an answer to that, not even Edgar. The rain continued to fall, though its intensity had lessened somewhat, as if nature itself was holding its breath to see what would happen next. Solomon Wright, who had remained silent through the exchange, suddenly stepped forward, moving slowly and deliberately. His aged face held no fear, only a resolute determination that commanded attention from humans and bears alike. "I know what must be done," he said quietly, reaching into his coat pocket. The bears tensed, watching his movement with suspicious eyes. From the pocket, Solomon withdrew not a weapon, but a small, tarnished key. "This opens the lock on her collar," he explained, holding the key up so all could see. "I took it from the hunting lodge 3 days ago when they first chained her. I couldn't bring myself to free her then, too much of a coward, I suppose, but I couldn't let the key be lost either." "You old fool," Edgar hissed. "Those bears will kill us all if freed completely." "They'll kill us anyway if we don't resolve this," Solomon retorted, his weathered face set with determination. "The post is broken, the female is partially free already. Our only hope is to remove the chain completely and let them return to the forest, as a family." Murmurs of dissent and fear rippled through the gathered villagers. The idea of deliberately approaching the bears to unlock the collar seemed like suicide to most. Yet, as they watched, it became clear that the standoff could not continue indefinitely. The bears were growing more agitated by the moment, the male pacing slightly, the female shifting her weight from paw to paw. Only Ellie remained perfectly calm, her eyes moving between her father and the bear family with complete trust that neither would harm her. "Let me do it," Thatcher said suddenly, extending his hand toward Solomon. "Give me the key." Iris gasped, clutching at her husband's sleeve. "Thatcher, no. It's too dangerous." He turned to her, his face etched with the terrible responsibility of the moment. "Our daughter is standing between us and those bears. Every second we delay increases the risk that someone makes a wrong move." He looked back at Solomon. "The key, now." The old man hesitated only briefly before placing the tarnished metal in Thatcher's palm. "Move slowly," he advised. "No sudden movements, and speak softly. They understand more than we give them credit for." Thatcher nodded grimly, then turned to face the bears and his daughter. Taking a deep breath, he lowered himself slightly, making his tall frame less threatening, and began to inch forward. "Ellie," he called softly, "stay very still, sweetheart. Daddy's coming to help." The child's face brightened at his approach, apparently oblivious to the danger that had every adult holding their breath. The bears, however, were acutely aware of the threat. The male growled, the sound reverberating across the meadow like distant thunder. The female's eyes tracked Thatcher's every movement, her body coiled to spring if he made any threatening gesture toward her cub. "It's all right," Thatcher continued, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. "I'm going to help remove the chain. No one's going to hurt anyone." He wasn't sure if he was trying to reassure the bears or himself. Either way, he continued his slow approach, the key clutched tightly in his trembling hand. The distance between him and Ellie seemed to stretch forever, each step through the mud requiring conscious effort not to rush, not to show fear. When he was just a few feet from his daughter, the male bear let out another warning growl, this one more insistent. Thatcher froze, sweat mingling with rainwater on his forehead despite the chill. "Papa," Ellie said suddenly, reaching out a tiny hand toward him. "Help Bear." Something in her voice, the absolute certainty, the trust, steadied Thatcher's nerves. He took the final steps to reach his daughter, never taking his eyes off the bears who watched his every move with primal intensity. "I'm here, Ellie," he murmured, quickly checking her for injuries. Finding none, he felt a moment of profound relief, followed immediately by the realization that the hardest part was yet to come. He would need to approach the female bear directly to unlock the collar. The bear in question stood her ground, neither retreating nor advancing, the heavy chain still attached to her neck dragging in the mud behind her. The collar had clearly been chafing. Even from where he stood, Thatcher could see raw skin beneath the wet fur where the metal had rubbed. A pang of shame shot through him. He hadn't participated in capturing and chaining the bear. He'd been away hunting when that occurred, but he hadn't opposed such actions in the past either. Like most in the village, he'd viewed bears as threats to be eliminated or controlled, not as beings capable of the family bonds he now witnessed. "I'm going to remove the chain," he said aloud, not sure if he was addressing the bears, Ellie, or the watching villagers. Perhaps all of them. He held up the key where the female bear could see it, then gestured toward her collar. Understanding seemed to flicker in the bear's dark eyes, though Thatcher knew that might be his imagination. Still, she didn't retreat when he took another step forward, the key extended before him like an offering. The male bear growled again, taking a step toward Thatcher. The villagers gasped collectively, certain they were about to witness the man being torn apart. Iris cried out her husband's name, the sound piercing the tense atmosphere. But then, something remarkable happened. The female bear turned toward her mate and made a soft huffing sound, almost like a reprimand. The male hesitated, clearly torn between protecting his family and trusting his mate's judgment. After what seemed an eternity, he settled back slightly, though his powerful muscles remained tensed for action. Thatcher seized the moment. With extreme care, he reached toward the female bear's collar, the key trembling between his fingers. The bear's hot breath washed over his hand as she sniffed suspiciously at him, but she didn't snap or growl. Behind him, he could hear Ellie's soft humming, the same soothing tune from earlier, and wondered if it was somehow keeping the bears calm. The key slipped into the lock with a faint click. Thatcher held his breath as he turned it, feeling the mechanism release. With one final twist, the collar fell open, its weight pulling it down into the mud. The female bear shook herself vigorously, as if shedding more than just a physical restraint. Droplets of water flew from her fur, some hitting Thatcher's face, but he remained still, unwilling to trigger an aggressive response with any sudden movement. For a long moment, nothing happened. The freed bear simply stood there, her dark eyes fixed on Thatcher's face. Then, slowly, deliberately, she lowered her massive head and nudged Ellie gently with her snout, a gesture that might have been gratitude or acknowledgement, or something humans had no word for. Ellie giggled, reaching up to touch the bear's wet nose with her tiny fingers. "Bye-bye, bear," she said cheerfully, as if this were nothing more than a playmate leaving after an afternoon visit. The female bear backed away, moving toward her mate at the forest's edge. The cub followed, but not before casting one last curious look at the strange human cub who had shared its mother's protection. Then, as silently as they had appeared, the bear family melted into the shadowed forest, leaving behind only paw prints in the mud and a tale that would be told in Pinewood Glen for generations. A collective exhale seemed to pass through the gathered villagers. Some sank to their knees in the mud, overcome with relief. Others began talking all at once, their voices creating a cacophony of exclamations and questions. Iris broke free from the crowd, rushing forward to scoop Ellie into her arms, sobbing as she clutched her daughter to her chest. Thatcher remained kneeling in the mud, staring at the abandoned collar and chain, the instrument of cruelty that had nearly led to tragedy. His hands shook as the adrenaline began to subside, the full weight of what had just transpired crashing down upon him. Solomon Wright approached slowly, his aged face solemn yet somehow lighter than before, as if a burden had been lifted from his shoulders as well. "You did well," the old man said simply, resting a gnarled hand on Thatcher's shoulder. "It wasn't me," Thatcher replied, his eyes finding his daughter, now being fussed over by half the village women, while the men continued to stare warily at the forest edge. It was Ellie. Somehow, she knew what to do when none of us did. Solomon nodded thoughtfully. The young often see what we cannot. Their hearts haven't yet learned fear or prejudice. As the rain finally began to ease, giving way to weak sunlight breaking through the clouds, the villagers of Pinewood Glen slowly made their way back toward their homes, each processing the miraculous events in their own way. Thatcher carried Ellie, who was now sleepy after her adventure, her head resting against his shoulder, as if she hadn't just bridged an ancient divide between humans and bears. Clara Bennett walked alongside them, her shrewd eyes studying the child with newfound interest. "That child is special," she murmured to Thatcher and Iris. "You would do well to nurture whatever gift she possesses." Iris, still shaken, clutched her husband's free hand. "I don't understand what happened today," she admitted. How did she know to go to the bear? Why wasn't she afraid? Why didn't they harm her? Clara smiled enigmatically. Some souls are born old, with wisdom beyond their years, and some are born with the ability to see past differences that blind the rest of us. She looked toward the forest where the bears had disappeared. Perhaps both are true of your daughter. As they reached their cottage, something caught Thatcher's eye. A small, dark object on their doorstep that hadn't been there before. Handing Ellie to Iris, he went to investigate, bending down to examine the mysterious item. It was a perfect pine cone, larger than any he'd seen before, placed with what seemed like deliberate care exactly in the center of their threshold. "What is it?" Iris asked, shifting Ellie in her arms. Thatcher picked up the pine cone, turning it over in his hands. "I'm not sure," he replied, though something told him it was no accident that this object had appeared at their door on this of all days. Perhaps a gift. As they entered their home, none of them noticed the pair of amber eyes watching from the forest edge, nor the large paw prints in the mud that led directly to their door and back again to the trees. Inside the warm cottage, Iris set about preparing a bath for Ellie, who was caked with mud from her adventure. The child seemed utterly unaffected by the day's events, babbling happily as her mother removed her sodden clothes. "Bear nice," she told her mother confidently, as Iris poured warm water into the wooden tub. Bear said thank you. Iris's hands stilled, the water pitcher hovering over the tub. "The bear spoke to you." Ellie nodded solemnly, as if this were the most natural thing in the world. Not words like Mama and Papa, different words. She tapped her chest. Here words. A chill that had nothing to do with her wet clothes ran through Iris. She looked up to find Thatcher standing in the doorway, his face pale as he listened to their daughter. "Did the bear tell you anything else?" he asked quietly, coming to kneel beside the tub. Ellie thought for a moment, her brow furrowing in concentration. Bear said, "Remember." Her vocabulary seemed insufficient for whatever message she was trying to convey, and frustration briefly clouded her features. Then her face brightened. Bear said, "Come back." "When moon big?" Iris and Thatcher exchanged alarmed glances over their daughter's head. The full moon was just days away. "Ellie," Thatcher said carefully, "you must never go back to the forest alone. It's very dangerous. The bears might have been gentle today, but they're still wild animals." Ellie shook her head stubbornly. "Not dangerous, friends." She splashed playfully in the bathwater, apparently considering the conversation over. But for her parents, it was just beginning. Long after Ellie had been bathed, fed, and put to bed, they sat by the fire discussing the implications of the day's events and their daughter's strange connection to the bears. "We could leave," Iris suggested, though her tone lacked conviction. Pinewood Glen was the only home either of them had ever known. Find a place where there are no bears to tempt her. Thatcher shook his head slowly. "Bears are everywhere in these mountains, and after today, I'm not convinced distance would matter." He stared into the fire, watching the flames dance. "You heard what Clara said. Ellie has some kind of gift. Running from it won't make it go away." "But she's just a baby," Iris protested, tears welling in her eyes. "How can we protect her if she insists on walking into danger?" Thatcher had no answer for that. Instead, he pulled his wife close, offering what comfort he could through his presence. Outside, the storm had fully passed, leaving behind a sky full of stars and a forest full of secrets. In her small bed, Ellie Reed slept peacefully, her dreams filled with gentle bears and forests where humans and animals lived in harmony. and deep in the mountains, in a den lined with dried leaves and pine needles, a bear family curled together for warmth, the memory of a fearless human child still fresh in their minds. The stillness of night settled over Pinewood Glen, but beneath the quiet lay the sense that something fundamental had shifted, that old boundaries had been crossed and new possibilities revealed. For better or worse, the village would never be quite the same. Neither would the forest. 3 days passed, and life in Pinewood Glen attempted to return to normal, though the events by the old barn remained the sole topic of conversation throughout the village. The story grew with each retelling. The bears became larger, the storm more violent, little Ellie's actions more deliberate and miraculous. Some villagers claimed the male bear had spoken actual words, while others insisted they'd seen a golden light surrounding the child as she stood between man and beast. Clara Bennett discouraged such embellishments, but even she couldn't deny that something extraordinary had occurred that rainy afternoon. For the Reed family, the days passed in a strange mixture of relief and apprehension. Thatcher had taken to checking the locks on doors and windows each night with obsessive thoroughness, while Iris rarely let Ellie out of her sight, even refusing Clara's offer to watch the child while she did the washing. As for Ellie herself, she seemed unchanged by her adventure, except for one noticeable difference. She had begun to draw bears. Crude, childish drawings covered scraps of paper, the backs of old letters, even the margins of Thatcher's hunting journal. Always the same scene, 3 bears and a small figure that could only be herself, standing beneath something that resembled a full moon. "She's never shown interest in drawing before," Iris whispered to her husband as they watched Ellie scribble by candlelight, her tiny tongue sticking out in concentration. "And she's never seen the full moon. We always have her in bed well before moonrise." Thatcher nodded grimly. "It's tonight," he said, his voice low to keep Ellie from hearing. "The full moon." The knowledge hung between them like a physical presence. Neither had forgotten Ellie's words about returning when moon big. Thatcher had taken precautions, enlisting 2 of his most trusted friends to take shifts watching their cottage through the night, while he himself planned to sleep in the main room, directly in front of the door. Solomon Wright had visited that morning, bringing a strange gift, a small leather pouch filled with pungent herbs that he instructed them to hang above Ellie's bed. "Bear repellent," he'd explained when Iris wrinkled her nose at the sharp scent. "An old hunter's trick. Bears hate the smell." Iris had accepted the offering gratefully, though privately, she wondered if any herb could deter a bear determined enough to seek out a human child. Still, she'd hung the pouch as directed, hoping the old man's woodcraft might provide some additional protection. As evening approached, tension in the Reed cottage grew palpable. Ellie became unusually fussy at dinner, refusing her favorite berry preserves and staring longingly out the window as the sun began to set. When Iris attempted to prepare her for bed earlier than usual, the child threw her first genuine tantrum, screaming and thrashing with such force that both parents were left bewildered. "No sleep," Ellie wailed, tears streaming down her reddened face. "Moon coming, bear waiting." The words sent a chill through Thatcher's heart. "How does she know?" he whispered to Iris over their daughter's sobs. "We've been careful not to speak of it in front of her." Iris shook her head helplessly, her own eyes filling with tears of frustration and fear. "I don't know. I don't understand any of this." It took nearly an hour to calm Ellie enough for sleep, and even then, her rest was fitful. She tossed beneath her blankets, small whimpers escaping her lips as though she were communicating with someone in her dreams. Iris sat beside the bed, stroking her daughter's hair until the child finally fell into a deeper sleep, her face smoothing into peaceful lines. "I'll take the first watch," Thatcher said from the doorway, his hunting knife visible at his belt. "You should rest while you can." Iris nodded wearily, though she doubted sleep would find her this night. "Do you think they'll really come for her? The bears?" Thatcher's face was grim in the dim light. "I don't know, but if they do, they'll have to go through me first." Outside, as darkness settled over the forest, clouds drifted across the sky, occasionally obscuring the rising moon. In the village, doors were locked, shutters secured. Those who had witnessed the event at the barn had spread the word about the full moon, and while many dismissed Ellie's words as childish nonsense, few were willing to take chances where bears were concerned. In his small cabin at the village edge, Solomon Wright sat by his window, a mug of strong tea in his gnarled hands, his eyes fixed on the path that led to the Reed cottage. Unlike the other villagers, he did not seem afraid. Rather, his weathered face held an expression of anticipation, as though he were waiting for a long-expected visitor. "It's been too long," he murmured to himself, his breath fogging the glass. "Far too long." The moon rose higher, its silver light filtering through the clouds to cast shifting shadows across the village. In the Reed cottage, all was quiet. Thatcher sat in a chair positioned directly in front of the door, his rifle across his knees, fighting against the pull of sleep. Outside, his friends Martin and Caleb patrolled the perimeter, their own weapons at the ready. Just after midnight, a sound disturbed the silence, a soft scratching at Ellie's window. In her bed, the child's eyes flew open, though she made no sound. With the quiet deliberation of someone much older, she slipped from beneath her blankets and padded to the window. The scratching came again, more insistent this time. Ellie stood on tiptoe, just tall enough to reach the latch that secured the shutters. With tiny fingers, she worked at the mechanism until she felt it give. The shutters swung open with a quiet creak, revealing the moonlit night beyond, and a small furry face peering in at her. The bear cub had grown since their last encounter, its body more substantial, its movements more confident. It balanced on the wide windowsill, dark eyes fixed on Ellie with unmistakable recognition. "Bear," Ellie whispered, a smile spreading across her face. "You came." The cub made a soft huffing sound that might have been agreement. It glanced over its shoulder, then back at Ellie, clearly wanting her to follow. Without hesitation, the child began to clamber onto the sill, her nightgown catching on a nail as she moved. In the main room, Thatcher jerked awake, unsure what had disturbed his slumber. A faint sound reached his ears, not from outside where his friends kept watch, but from within the cottage, from Ellie's room. "Ellie?" he called softly, rising from his chair. When no answer came, he moved quickly to her doorway, pushing it open. Moonlight streamed through the open window, illuminating an empty bed. The curtains fluttered in the breeze where the shutters had been flung wide. "Iris!" Thatcher shouted, panic flooding his system. "She's gone! Ellie's gone!" Iris bolted upright in their bed, disoriented for only a moment before her husband's words penetrated the fog of sleep. She was on her feet in an instant, rushing to her daughter's room as Thatcher flung open the front door, bellowing for Martin and Caleb. "How?" Iris cried, staring at the open window in disbelief. "It's too high for her to reach the latch, and even if she could, she's too small to climb out alone." Thatcher didn't answer, already striding toward his friends who came running at his shouts. "The bears," he said grimly when they reached him. "They've taken her." "Impossible," Martin protested, his face pale in the moonlight. "We've been watching all night. Nothing's approached the cottage, bear or otherwise." "Then how do you explain that?" Thatcher demanded, pointing to a set of prints in the soft earth beneath Ellie's window. Small bear tracks, fresh and unmistakable. Caleb swore softly, crossing himself. The cub. But where are the adults? A cub wouldn't travel alone, especially at night. As if in answer to his question, a low, rumbling growl emanated from the forest edge. The men turned as one, their weapons raised, to see a pair of gleaming eyes reflecting the moonlight from between the trees. "Thatcher," Iris called from the doorway, her voice trembling with fear. "Look." She pointed toward the ground at her feet, where something caught the moonlight. A small, child-sized footprint in the dirt, heading toward the forest. Beside it, the unmistakable paw print of a bear cub. "They're going somewhere together," Thatcher realized, the rifle lowering slightly in his confusion. "She wasn't taken. She's following the cub." "But why?" Martin asked, his own weapon still trained on the watching eyes. "And where are they going?" Thatcher took a deep breath, making a decision that went against every protective instinct he possessed. "There's only one way to find out." He turned to Iris. "Stay here in case she returns. Martin, Caleb with me." "You can't be serious," Caleb protested. "You're going to follow those bears into the forest? At night?" "That's my daughter out there," Thatcher replied, his voice leaving no room for argument. "And something tells me if the bears wanted to harm her, they wouldn't have bothered luring her away. They could have taken her from her bed." Iris stepped forward, her face resolute despite her fear. "I'm coming with you." Thatcher opened his mouth to argue, then closed it again, recognizing the determination in his wife's eyes. Instead, he nodded once, handing her the smaller hunting knife from his belt. "Stay close to me." With that, the small party set off toward the forest, following the intermingled tracks of child and cub. The eyes that had been watching withdrew deeper among the trees as they approached, always visible but remaining just out of reach, seeming to guide them along a path that grew less distinct with each passing minute. They had been walking for perhaps a quarter hour when Martin suddenly grabbed Thatcher's arm, pointing to their right. "There," he whispered. "I saw movement." Before any of them could react, a massive shape detached itself from the shadows ahead, the male bear standing directly in their path. Behind him, barely visible in the dappled moonlight, stood his mate, her familiar form unmistakable. Caleb raised his rifle, but Thatcher pushed the barrel down. "No," he said firmly, "not unless they attack." "Are you mad?" Caleb hissed. "They're blocking our way." "No," Iris said suddenly, understanding dawning in her eyes. "They're showing us the way. Look." She pointed to a narrow gap between the trees that they might have missed, a path that led deeper into the forest, away from any trail known to the villagers. The female bear moved toward this opening, looking back at them expectantly. "They want us to follow them," Thatcher said, his voice filled with wonder and trepidation. "It's a trap," Martin insisted. "Bears aren't guides, they're predators." "Not these bears," Iris replied with a certainty that surprised even her. "Not with Ellie." Before the men could argue further, she stepped forward, following the female bear into the narrow path. After a moment's hesitation, Thatcher hurried after her, leaving Martin and Caleb to exchange bewildered glances before reluctantly following. The path wound through increasingly unfamiliar territory, taking them deeper into the forest than any of them had ventured before. The tree canopy grew denser, limiting the moonlight that reached the forest floor. Yet, strangely, neither bear seemed to have any difficulty navigating the darkness, and the humans found that if they stayed close, they could follow without stumbling. "This isn't natural," Caleb whispered nervously. "Bears leading humans through a forest at night? It's like something from a fairy tale." "Or a nightmare," Martin added, his knuckles white around his rifle. Thatcher made no reply, his focus entirely on keeping his wife and himself close to their unlikely guides. The forest around them had grown quiet. The usual nocturnal sounds, hooting owls, rustling small creatures, conspicuously absent, as if the entire wood was holding its breath. After what seemed like hours, but was likely less than one, the trees began to thin. Ahead, moonlight shimmered on what appeared to be a clearing. The bears slowed their pace, approaching the edge with what almost appeared to be reverence. When they reached the tree line, the sight before them stopped all four humans in their tracks. The clearing was perfectly circular, as if designed rather than naturally formed. At its center stood an enormous oak tree, its massive trunk wider than 3 men could encircle with their arms, its branches spreading outward to form a natural canopy that left the center of the clearing open to the night sky. The full moon hung directly above, bathing the scene in silver light. And there, sitting at the base of the great oak, was Ellie. The bear cub lay beside her, its head in her lap as she stroked its fur, both of them watching the approaching group with calm expectation. But they were not alone. Surrounding the tree, in a circle that mirrored the clearing's shape, were animals, dozens of them. Deer with proud antlers, foxes with bright, intelligent eyes, a family of raccoons, several rabbits, an elderly wolf with graying muzzle, even a majestic eagle perched on a low branch. All different species, many natural enemies, yet all coexisting peacefully in this strange midnight gathering. "What in God's name?" Martin breathed, lowering his rifle in shock. "The council," came a familiar voice from behind them. The group turned to find Solomon Wright emerging from the forest path, leaning heavily on his walking stick, his aged face serene. "You knew about this?" Thatcher demanded, keeping his voice low to avoid disturbing the bizarre assembly. Solomon nodded, his eyes fixed on Ellie and the assembled animals. "I suspected. Haven't seen a true speaker born in these parts for nearly 70 years, not since my grandmother." "A speaker?" Iris questioned, her eyes never leaving her daughter. "What are you talking about, Solomon?" The old man smiled gently. "One who can speak to both the human world and the natural one. A bridge between realms that have grown too far apart." He gestured toward Ellie. "Your daughter has a gift, a rare one. The animals recognized it before any human could." "That's superstitious nonsense," Caleb scoffed, though his voice lacked conviction as he stared at the impossible scene before them. "Is it?" Solomon challenged, pointing toward the circle of animals. "Then explain that. Explain why predator and prey sit together without fear. Explain why bears led you through a forest instead of attacking. Explain why your daughter, who can barely form complete sentences, understands what those creatures are saying." As if to emphasize his point, Ellie looked up at that moment, her face brightening at the sight of her parents. "Mama! Papa!" she called, her voice carrying clearly across the clearing. "Come see?" "Big meeting." The animals stirred at her words but did not flee. Instead, they seemed to be waiting, watching the humans with various degrees of wariness and curiosity. "What do we do?" Thatcher whispered to Solomon, finding himself deferring to the old man's apparent knowledge of this uncanny situation. "We go to her," Solomon replied simply. "We've been invited to the council. It would be impolite to refuse." Before Thatcher could question further, Solomon stepped forward into the clearing, his movement unhurried and respectful. After a moment's hesitation, Iris followed, unable to resist the pull toward her daughter. Thatcher came next, his protective instincts overriding his confusion. Martin and Caleb exchanged glances before reluctantly joining them, their weapons lowered, but still clutched tightly in their hands. As they crossed the moonlit space, The animals watched them with unnervingly intelligent eyes. The bears that had led them took positions on either side of the great oak, like sentinels guarding a sacred place. When they reached Ellie, the child beamed up at them, apparently untroubled by the extraordinary circumstances. "Ellie," Iris said softly, kneeling beside her daughter, "what is this place? What are you doing here?" "Council meeting," Ellie replied matter-of-factly, continuing to stroke the cub's fur. "Animals talk, fix things." Thatcher knelt on her other side, his bewilderment evident. "Fix what things, sweetheart?" Ellie frowned slightly, struggling to find words for concepts beyond her vocabulary. Hunting too much, houses too many, trees falling. She pointed to the bear family, their home gone, hungry. Understanding began to dawn on the Thatcher's face. "They're talking about us, humans, about how we're expanding into their territory." Solomon nodded gravely. "The balance has been shifting for years. That female bear was chained because she came too close to the village. But she came close because her traditional hunting grounds have been steadily shrinking as we cut more trees and build more homes. And we're supposed to believe that animals called a meeting to discuss this." Caleb asked incredulously, though his voice had lost much of its earlier skepticism as he stared at the gathered creatures. "They've always had councils," Solomon replied. "But it's been generations since they've invited humans to attend. They need a speaker for that, someone who can translate their concerns to us and our responses to them." "Ellie," Martin said, his voice hollow with disbelief. "You're saying Ellie is this speaker?" As if in answer, the elderly wolf stood and approached the small group, its movement slow but dignified. The men tensed, but Ellie showed no fear. Instead, she gazed intently at the wolf, head tilted as if listening. After a moment, she turned to her parents. "Wolf says hello," she said simply. "Very old, very wise, leader of council." The wolf sat directly in front of Solomon, its amber eyes fixed on the old man with what appeared to be recognition. "Hello, old friend," Solomon murmured, surprising the others by reaching out to gently touch the wolf's head. "It's been a long time." "You know this wolf?" Thatcher asked, his worldview shifting with each passing minute. "My grandmother was a speaker," Solomon explained, his eyes never leaving the wolf. "She brought me to council meetings when I was a boy, though I never had the gift myself. This one," he nodded toward the wolf, "was just a pup then. Time passes differently for them, but not so differently that we can't recognize old acquaintances." Ellie was watching the wolf intently again, her small face screwed up in concentration. "Wolf says, humans forget. Old promise, living together." She looked up at her father, her expression earnest. "Need new promise." Solomon nodded thoughtfully. "The old agreements have faded from memory. When my grandmother died, the last link between our worlds was lost. Until now." He looked at Ellie with something like pride. "Until your daughter was born." "What agreements?" Iris asked, looking between Solomon and the wolf. "What are they asking of us?" The wolf turned its gaze to Iris, studying her with intelligence that seemed beyond that of an ordinary animal. Ellie watched the wolf for a long moment before speaking again. "Share," she said simply. "East forest for animals. West forest for humans. River between." She pointed in the corresponding directions. "No more chains, no more traps. Animals stay away from houses. Humans stay away from dens." Thatcher looked at Solomon in amazement. "They're proposing boundaries? Territories?" "It's what we've always done," Solomon replied. "Before guns and steel traps, before we began to see ourselves as separate from the natural world, our ancestors understood the need for balance. The agreements were renewed with each generation. He gestured toward the assembled animals. They remember, even if we've forgotten. Martin stepped forward, his earlier fear giving way to cautious curiosity. And if we refuse? What then? The bear that had been chained rose to her full height, letting out a low growl that needed no translation. The message was clear. Peace was being offered, but it was not the only option. War, Ellie said, her childish voice giving the word an especially chilling quality. Bad for all, many die. A heavy silence fell over the clearing. Even the night breeze seemed to still, waiting for the human's response. Thatcher looked at his daughter, this miraculous child who somehow bridged worlds he had never known existed. Then he looked at the gathered animals, not as threats or resources, but as fellow inhabitants of the same forest that had sustained his family for generations. "We would need to speak with the entire village," he said finally, addressing both Solomon and the animals directly. "I cannot make such agreements alone." Ellie listened to something unheard by the others, then nodded. "Wolf says yes. 7 days. Bring village leaders here." She pointed to the great oak. "Full moon again in 1 month. Final promise, then." Solomon translated for the others. "They're giving us time to consult with the village. We'll return in a week with our answer, and if we agree, a formal pact will be made at the next full moon." The wolf stood, apparently satisfied with this arrangement. One by one, the other animals began to disperse, melting back into the forest with silent efficiency until only the bear family, the wolf, and the humans remained. "Time to go home," Ellie announced, gently shifting the cub from her lap and standing up. The cub seemed reluctant to part from her, nuzzling against her hand before rejoining its parents. As they prepared to leave, the mother bear approached Ellie once more. Thatcher tensed, but Iris laid a restraining hand on his arm, instinctively understanding that no harm would come to their daughter. The bear lowered her massive head, gently touching her nose to Ellie's forehead in what could only be described as a gesture of blessing or gratitude. "Bear says thank you," Ellie translated, reaching up to touch the animal's fur without fear. "For blanket, for key." She looked at her father. "For understanding." Thatcher swallowed hard, emotion tightening his throat. Tell her she's welcome," he managed, "and that I'm sorry for the chain." Ellie didn't need to translate. The bear's eyes met Thatcher's, and something passed between them. Acknowledgement, perhaps, or forgiveness. Then she backed away, rejoining her mate and cub at the edge of the clearing. "They'll show us the way home," Solomon said, nodding toward the bears. "A different path than the one we took here. Shorter, and they want to show us the boundaries they've proposed." As they followed their animal guides through the moonlit forest, Thatcher carried Ellie, who was finally showing signs of exhaustion after her extraordinary night. Her head rested against his shoulder, her eyes drooping despite her obvious effort to stay awake. "Papa," she murmured sleepily. "Animals nice, just scared." "I know, sweetheart," he replied, his view of the world forever altered. "Like people, we're all just trying to protect what we love." Ellie nodded, satisfied with his understanding. "Council meetings sometimes, not always full moon. Bear will tell me. Wolf, too." "And will come," Iris promised, walking beside them. "Whenever they call." As they emerged from the forest at a point much closer to the village than where they had entered, the bears stopped. The family stood silhouetted against the moonlight, powerful and dignified. Ellie raised her head from her father's shoulder and waved a small hand in farewell. "Bye-bye," she called softly. "See you soon." The bears seemed to nod before turning and disappearing into the darkness, their mission complete. The humans continued toward the village, their minds filled with the impossible task before them, convincing their neighbors that a peace treaty with the forest's wild inhabitants was not only possible but necessary. "It won't be easy," Martin said, breaking the silence that had fallen over the group. "Most won't believe it without seeing for themselves." "Then they'll see for themselves," Thatcher replied with newfound determination. "We'll bring them to the next meeting, those who are willing." Caleb snorted skeptically. "Edgar Wilson, willing to make peace with bears. I'd sooner expect fish to fly." "People can surprise you," Solomon observed quietly, "when given reason to change." As they reached the edge of the village, the first light of dawn was beginning to thread the eastern sky. Ellie had fallen asleep in her father's arms, her face peaceful, untroubled by the weight of the role she had been born to play. For a moment, Thatcher envied her simplicity, her acceptance of a world where barriers between species could be crossed with childlike faith. "What now?" Iris asked softly, her hand finding her husband's free one as they approached their cottage. Thatcher looked down at their sleeping daughter, then up at the fading stars. "Now we begin the harder task," he said, "teaching adults what a child already knows, that understanding is better than fear, and that sometimes the most powerful thing we can offer is simply a blanket in the rain." Behind them, Solomon Wright smiled, a burden lifting from his aged shoulders. The old agreements would be renewed, the ancient balance restored, and all because a child had seen not with human eyes but with a heart unclouded by prejudice or fear. "The speaker has returned to Pinewood Glen," he whispered to the dawn, "and nothing will ever be the same."